In the dust-swept town of Hollow Creek, where whispers of forgotten legends drift through weathered wooden buildings, a band of ruthless outlaws made the gravest mistake of their blood-stained careers. They threatened the wrong saloonkeeper. They couldn't have known that the quiet man polishing glasses behind the worn oak bar was once known as the Ghost, a figure so feared that hardened killers would rather ride 100 miles through Apache territory than cross his path. They were about to learn that some legends don't die. They just wait patiently, serving whiskey and keeping peace until the day violence forces their hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows of the watering hole, painting amber stripes across its plank floors that had witnessed decades of boots, brawls, and spilled bourbon. Tom Sullivan moved with deliberate grace behind the bar, each motion measured and efficient. As he polished glasses that already gleamed, his weathered hands, marked with old scars that spoke of stories he never shared, handled each piece with surprising gentleness, as if making up for times when gentleness hadn't been an option. Margaret Wheeler counted the day's earnings at the far end of the bar, her steel-grey hair catching the sunlight. 10 years she'd owned this establishment, and for 10 years she'd watched Tom work with the same meticulous attention to detail, never wasting a movement, never speaking an unnecessary word. Sometimes she wondered if he even noticed how his eyes automatically tracked every person who entered, how his right hand never strayed far from beneath the bar, where she knew he kept more than just extra bottles. "Sometimes I think you polish those glasses just to keep your hands busy," she said, looking up from her ledger, studying the man who'd become more than just an employee over the years. The corner of Tom's mouth twitched slightly. What passed for a smile these days? "Everything needs purpose, Miss Margaret," he replied, his voice carrying that gentle quality that made people lean in closer to hear, even when discussing nothing more important than the weather. The saloon held its usual afternoon crowd, old Jack Thompson nursing his whiskey in the corner, his rheumy eyes holding memories of the gold rush days. Sheriff David Carson enjoying his coffee at his regular table, badge gleaming in the fading light, and Doc Williams reading his medical journal by the window, occasionally glancing up to observe the quiet dance of the saloon's daily life. The ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, stirring air that smelled of leather, tobacco, and approaching rain. Sheriff Carson's deputy burst through the swinging doors, his spurs jingling with urgency. The sheriff's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but Tom's subtle headshake stopped him. The saloonkeeper's movements slowed imperceptibly as he dried another glass, though his expression remained neutral, his eyes already mapping the young man's path to the bar, noting his tension, reading the story written in his hurried stride. "Trouble?" he asked as the deputy approached the bar, boots scraping softly on the wooden floor. The word carried weight in his mouth, like he'd tasted its bitter flavor too many times before. "Maybe," the young deputy sighed, removing his hat and running a nervous hand through his hair. "Got word from Silver Creek that the Raven Gang hit another business there yesterday, fourth one this month. They're getting bolder, meaner with each. A raid." Margaret set aside her ledger, moving closer. "Protection money." Her voice carried the worry of a businesswoman who'd built something worth protecting. The deputy nodded grimly. "Started with demands for security fees. When people refused to pay." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear in the way his eyes dropped to study the worn bar top. "They made examples, bad ones." Tom set down his glass and cloth with precise care, his movements carrying the weight of decision rather than hesitation. "How far out?" "Day's ride now," the deputy replied, watching Tom's face carefully. "Moving this way. Sheriff Turner over there says they're led by a man calls himself Black Jack Morrison. Ex-cavalry, turned bad after the war, mean streak wider than the Rio Grande. Word is he was always cruel, but the war, he swallowed hard, the war just gave him a taste for it. The afternoon light caught the silver in Tom's hair as he reached for another glass. Most people would have missed it, but Margaret saw how his movements had changed, become even more controlled, more measured, like a mountain lion carefully holding itself in check. She'd seen this transformation before, rarely, in moments when trouble threatened their peaceful establishment, but something felt different this time. Doc Williams spoke up from his table, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken knowledge. Might be time to consider hiring some protection, Margaret. Town this size, David here, can't be everywhere. And these aren't just common bandits we're talking about. Blackjack's men. They're organized, military trained. Tom's hands stilled completely for a moment, the glass in his grip catching the light just so, sending prisms dancing across the wall. Town this size shouldn't need protection, he said quietly. Not if people stand together. Not if they remember that evil only prospers when good men look away. The words hung in the air, carrying more weight than their simple meaning suggested. Sheriff Carson studied his old friend's face, seeing perhaps something there that others missed. The two men had known each other since the border wars, though neither ever spoke of those days, of the things they'd seen, of the choices they'd had to make. "Some fights aren't worth picking, Tom," Carson said softly, but his tone suggested he already knew the response he'd receive. Tom resumed his polishing, but his eyes had taken on a distant look, seeing perhaps not the gleaming glass in his hands, but other times, other places where violence had forced good men's hands. "Some fights pick you, David, whether you want them or not. The only choice we get is how we meet them." The sound of horses' hooves echoed from somewhere down the street, drawing everyone's attention. They passed without stopping, but the tension in the room didn't fully dissipate. Margaret watched as Tom methodically arranged bottles on the shelf, his movements precise as ever, but now carrying a different quality, like a cougar trying to move like a house cat. She'd seen him do this before on the rare occasions when trouble threatened their peaceful town, but something felt different this time, more final, as if long-dormant gears had begun to turn. As the setting sun continued to paint the town in deepening shades of red and gold, something had changed in the watering hole. In the gathering dusk, Margaret watched Tom's reflection in the bar mirror, noting how his right hand had settled at his side, thumb resting where a holster might once have ridden. Some habits, it seemed, never quite died. They just waited patiently for the moment when they'd be needed again. Part 2, Gathering Storm. As dusk settled over Hollow Creek, the air grew thick with more than just the promise of rain. Jack Thompson spoke up from his corner, his voice rough with age and whiskey, breaking the uneasy silence that had fallen over the watering hole. "Heard stories about this Blackjack Morrison," he said, drawing every eye in the room. "Say he don't just take money. Say he likes to make examples, show folks what happens when you don't bow to his kind of authority." Tom's reflection in the bar mirror showed no reaction, but Margaret noticed how his right hand had settled into an old familiar position, thumb resting where a gun belt might once have rode. Some habits, she observed silently, never quite died. "Authority," Tom said quietly, almost to himself, "isn't earned through fear." His voice carried a weight that seemed to make the room feel suddenly smaller, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sheriff Carson finished his coffee and stood, adjusting his gun belt with practiced ease. "I'll make some rounds," he said. "See about getting extra deputies from the county, if we need them." 2 days, Tom replied, not looking up from his work. "That's how long it takes for help to arrive from the county seat, assuming they can spare anyone at all." The sheriff paused, studying his old friend. "You seem mighty sure about that." "Just arithmetic, David," Tom said softly. "Nothing more." But his words carried a weight that made the room feel suddenly colder, as if winter had crept in through the cracks in the floorboards. Through the windows, they could see townspeople hurrying home earlier than usual, casting nervous glances at the darkening horizon. The wind had picked up, carrying dust and whispered rumors through the streets of Hollow Creek. Doc Williams gathered his things, preparing to leave, but at the door, he turned back. "Don't forget those headache powders I ordered for you, Tom. Came in on yesterday's stage." His words seemed oddly placed, given the tension in the room. Tom nodded, though everyone present knew he hadn't suffered a headache in all the years they'd known him. It was just one of those little fictions they all maintained, like pretending not to notice how he could recall with perfect clarity where every patron sat and what they drank, even on the busiest nights, or how his eyes constantly tracked distances and angles, as if measuring the space between life and death. As the doctor left, Margaret noticed Tom's attention shift subtly to a group of strangers who'd just ridden into town. Through the window, she could see 3 men dismounting outside the general store, their manner carrying that particular brand of casual menace that spoke of violence held in check only by choice, not conscience. "Scouts," Tom said quietly, answering her unspoken question, measuring the town, marking key positions, counting potential threats. His hands never stopped their methodical work with the glasses, but his movements had taken on an even more precise quality. "How can you be sure?" Margaret asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew. "Because it's what I would have done," he replied softly, "in another life." Sheriff Carson returned, his face tight with fresh concern. "Got word from Silver Creek," he said in a low voice. "That business owner they made an example of? He didn't make it. Died. This morning, slow and painful, just like they wanted." Tom's hands stilled completely on the glass he was polishing, that deadly stillness Margaret had witnessed only once before, 3 years ago, when a drunk had pulled a knife on young Mary from the bakery. "Tell me," he said, his voice carrying that gentle quality that somehow seemed more dangerous than anger. "Beat him bad," Carson continued, "but careful-like. Knew exactly how much damage to do, how to make it last. Military precision," the doctor said. "Then they kept anyone from helping him just to prove they could." The evening light caught Tom's profile as he processed this information, and for a moment Margaret saw something in his stance that didn't belong behind a bar. A deadly grace that spoke of skills learned in places where mercy was a luxury few could afford. "They'll be here by tomorrow," Tom said, his voice carrying certainty. 3, maybe 4 hours before sunset. They'll want the light behind them when they ride in, want to see every face clearly, read the fear in people's eyes. "How can you be so sure?" the sheriff asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Because that's how I'd do it," Tom replied, his gaze distant. "How I did do it once, hunting men who needed hunting." The admission hung in the air like gunsmoke after a firefight, heavy with implications none of them wanted to examine too closely. Outside, the wind continued to rise, rattling the windows slightly, as if nature itself was trying to warn them of what was coming. Margaret shivered despite the evening warmth. Something was riding toward Hollow Creek, something that would test all their bonds and beliefs. Looking at Tom's reflection in the bar mirror, she wondered if perhaps what they needed had been here, all along, just waiting quietly behind a bar, polishing glasses and keeping its own counsel until the day came when peace was no longer an option. The scouts outside mounted up and rode away, but their departure brought no relief. They'd seen what they came to see, measured what they came to measure. Tomorrow, Margaret knew, would bring the real test. As darkness settled over Hollow Creek, like a burial shroud, she watched Tom continue his endless routine of cleaning and arranging, noting how his eyes now regularly scanned the street through the front windows. She'd seen him do this before on the rare occasions when trouble threatened their peaceful town, but something felt different this time. This wasn't just preparation. It was prophecy. The ghost of the West, it seemed, was stirring from his long slumber, and Hollow Creek was about to learn why some legends were better left undisturbed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn painted the horizon in shades of purple and gold, but the usual morning bustle was notably subdued in Hollow Creek. Shop owners opened their doors with wary glances down the street, and mothers walked their children to school in tight groups, hurrying past the empty lots where unknown riders had been spotted the night before. Tom arrived at the watering hole earlier than usual, his boots silent on the wooden sidewalk. The morning light caught the silver in his hair as he unlocked the door, his movements unhurried but purposeful. Inside, he began his morning routine with the same precision he'd shown for 10 years, though his eyes moved to the windows more frequently than before. Margaret found him checking the hinges on the back door, his fingers moving with practiced expertise over the metal. "Those are new," she observed, setting down her purse. "When did you change them?" "Last night," Tom replied quietly, testing. "The doors swing. Old ones were wearing out." She watched him work, noting how his hands moved with a knowledge that seemed beyond simple maintenance. "You know about doors, Tom?" His lips twitched slightly. "Used to. In another life." He straightened, scanning the back alley through the door's small window. Different kinds of doors, different reasons for checking them. The morning passed with increasing tension as news filtered in from around town. Martha's Cafe reported 2 riders stopping for breakfast, asking too many questions about local businesses. The livery stable owner described 3 more watching his place from across the street, making notes in a small book. Sheriff Carson entered around 11, his face tight with concern. "Got more reports?" he said, settling at the bar as Tom poured his coffee without being asked. 2 more businesses in Silver Creek burned last night. No proof it was the Raven Gang, but nobody else it could be. Tom finished pouring, his voice soft but carrying an edge that made Margaret look up sharply. "The owners?" "Alive," Carson replied grimly. "Barely. Doc Williams knows his colleague over there. Says the man might walk again, but not soon. They wanted him alive, wanted him to be a reminder to others." The sheriff's deputy burst in, face flushed with urgency. "Riders coming in from the east, at least a dozen, maybe more." "Too early," Tom said quietly, but his voice carried that deadly certainty Margaret had come to recognize. "These aren't the main force. These are the ones who soften up a town, make people realize how helpless they are before the real threat arrives." As if to confirm his words, shots rang out from the direction of the bank. Not the chaotic firing of a robbery, but measured, precise shots that spoke of military training. Through the window, they watched as masked riders herded townspeople into the street, forcing them to kneel in the dust. "Time to go, Margaret," Tom said softly, but she heard the change in his voice, saw how his stance had shifted into something both more and less than the bartender she knew. "Tom," she started to protest, but he cut her off with a gentle shake of his head. "What happens next?" he said. "You don't need to see. What I have to become." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What I have to remember being. It's not something that should have witnesses." Through the window they could see one of the riders, larger than the others, directing operations with practiced efficiency. "That'll be Clayton Wade," Sheriff Carson said grimly. "Blackjack's advance man, ex-cavalry scout, has a reputation for enjoying his work too much." Tom's movements had become absolutely precise now, each motion calculated and purposeful. He reached beneath the bar, and when his hand emerged, it held something wrapped in oiled cloth. The package made a familiar sound as he set it on the bar top, a metallic whisper that spoke of well-maintained steel. "Tom," Margaret said softly, "whatever you're thinking." "Not thinking," he replied. his voice carrying that gentle quality that now seemed more dangerous than any shout. Remembering what has to be done when men mistake kindness for weakness. Outside, Wade's voice carried clearly through the morning air. This is just a taste, folks. Just a little demonstration of what happens when towns don't show proper respect. Boss'll be here by sundown, and he'll want to know you understand your situation. Tom unwrapped the package with reverent care, revealing a gun belt that had seen hard use but perfect maintenance. The holster was worn smooth in ways that spoke of countless draws, and the Colt it held seemed to drink in the morning light, its blued steel showing none of the gaudy embellishments favored by most gunmen. "That's not a normal 6-gun, Carson observed quietly, professional appreciation in his voice. "No," Tom agreed softly. "It's the gun they never saw. The one that earned me the name." His hands moved over the weapon with familiar grace. "They called me Ghost because no one ever saw me draw, never saw where the shots came from, just heard the thunder and watched their friends fall." More shots rang out, accompanied by the sound of breaking glass. Wade's men were systematically shooting out windows, a calculated display of power meant to breed fear and helplessness. "David," Tom said quietly to the sheriff, "get Margaret out the back way. Take her to Doc Williams's place." His voice took on that deadly softness. "What happens next? What I have to do? It's better if there aren't any badgers around to see it." "Tom," Margaret tried one last time, "you don't have to be this anymore. You left that life behind." He turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw not just the quiet bartender who'd served her town for 10 years, but something older, something that had learned its trade in blood and gunsmoke. "Some things you never leave behind, Miss Margaret. Some skills you just pray you never need again." His voice softened slightly. "But when you do need them, you thank God you kept them sharp." Through the window, they could see Wade organizing his men for another display of power. But something had changed in the watering hole. In the growing light of morning, Margaret watched Tom buckle on his gun belt with precise care, each motion speaking of skills learned through countless repetitions. The ghost of the West, it seemed, was about to remind some very dangerous men why legends are best left undisturbed. Clayton Wade's laughter echoed down the dusty street of Hollow Creek as his men continued their systematic destruction. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the faces of townspeople, forced to kneel in the dirt, watching their windows shatter one by one. What they couldn't have known was that each crack of breaking glass was marking time in a different way, counting down to something they hadn't seen in these parts for over a decade. Inside the watering hole, Tom Sullivan's transformation continued, but not in the way most would expect. There was no dramatic change in his expression, no sudden shift in his stance. Instead, it was more like watching a veil slowly lift, revealing what had always been there beneath the surface. His movements became even more precise, each motion carrying the weight of deadly purpose. "You're sure about this?" Sheriff Carson asked quietly, one hand on Margaret's arm, ready to lead her to safety. "Once you step out that door, once you show them what you really are, there's no going back. This town, these people, they'll never see you the same way again." Tom checked his gun with practiced efficiency, each motion smooth as flowing water. "They never saw me at all, David. They saw what they wanted to see, what I let them see, just like those riders out there seeing what they expect. A town too scared to fight back, a saloonkeeper too old to be a threat." Through the window, they watched as Wade dismounted, his spurs ringing against the wooden sidewalk as he approached Old Man Jenkins from the general store. "See, friend," Wade's voice carried clearly, dripping with false sympathy. "This is what happens when towns forget their place, when they need to be reminded that civilization out here, well, it's just a thin veneer over something much darker." "Ironic," Tom said softly, checking his gun belt one final time. "He's right about that part. just wrong about which side of civilization he's standing on. Margaret watched as Tom moved toward the door, noting how his walk had changed. The quiet grace of the bartender had evolved into something more deadly, the measured stride of a predator. "What are you going to do?" "What needs doing," Tom replied, his voice carrying that gentle quality that now seemed more warning than comfort. "What I should have done the first time I heard about Blackjack Morrison and his kind. Some men." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some men are like rabid wolves. They mistake kindness for weakness, mercy for fear, and eventually they need to learn different." Outside, Wade had pulled Jenkins to his feet, using the old man as an example. "Now, folks, when Blackjack gets here, he's going to want to know this town understands its situation, understands the natural order of things, and old Jenkins here, he's going to help us demonstrate what happens to people who need extra explaining." The morning air grew still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Tom's hand rested lightly on the saloon's swinging door. "David," he said quietly to the sheriff, "after this starts, get people clear. What's going to happen? It's not something decent folks should have to witness." "And you?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with concern. "What about you?" Tom's smile was gentle but carried no warmth. "Me? I'm about to remind some very dangerous men why they used to tell stories about ghosts in these parts, why mothers would warn their children that evil deeds draw the attention of things best left undisturbed." Wade had pulled his gun, pressing it against Jenkins's temple with theatrical flair. "Now, this is just a demonstration, folks. Just a little taste of what happens when let him go." Tom's voice cut through the morning air like a steel blade. Soft, but carrying an authority that made everyone, including Wade's men, turn toward the watering hole's entrance. Wade's laugh held genuine amusement. "Well, look here, boys. Seems we got ourselves a hero." His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Tom. "What's your name, old-timer? Want to make sure we spell it right on your marker." "Names," Tom replied, his voice still carrying that deadly softness, "are funny things out here. Some men spend their lives trying to make theirs mean something. Others spend their lives trying to live down what their names have come to mean." His eyes met Wade's directly. "Then there are those names that mothers used to whisper to make their children behave. Names that made even hardened killers check their back trail on dark nights." Something shifted in Wade's expression, a flicker of uncertainty quickly masked by bravado. "You talk pretty fancy for a saloonkeeper." "And you handle your weapon pretty poorly for a man who claims to be dangerous," Tom replied, his voice never rising. "Finger on the trigger like that. Tells me you're scared. Tells me you never learned the difference between threatening violence and being truly capable of it." Wade's face darkened with rage. "Boys," he called to his men, "seems like this old fool needs to be our first real example. Show folks what happens when—" The rest of his words were lost in the sudden, shocking display of speed that followed. Later, those who witnessed it would swear they never saw Tom's hand move, never saw the actual draw. There was just a whisper of steel on leather, a sound like distant thunder, and Wade's gun went spinning into the dust, accompanied by his surprised cry of pain. In the sudden silence that followed, Tom's voice carried clearly down the street, still soft, still measured, but now carrying an edge that made hardened killers check their weapons nervously. "That was your gun hand. Not a killing shot, just a reminder that some legends don't fade. They just wait patiently until they're needed again." The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, but no one was thinking about his age anymore. They were too busy studying how he held himself, how his gun seemed more like a natural extension of his arm than a separate tool. Most of all, they were starting to remember old stories, whispered tales of a ghost that hunted the worst of men, a spirit of justice that could appear like smoke and vanish like morning mist. The ghost of the West, it seemed, had just announced his return to a world that had forgotten why it feared him in the first place. The silence that followed Tom's display of skill hung heavy in the morning air, broken only by Wade's pained breathing as he cradled his injured hand. His men sat frozen on their horses, weapons half drawn but suddenly uncertain, as if realizing they'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple town intimidation. "Ghost!" Wade spat the word, recognition and fear mixing in his voice. "They said you were dead, said you disappeared after that business in Crimson Valley, after what you did to the Carson brothers." Tom's stance hadn't changed. His gun still held with casual readiness that spoke of decades of practice. "Funny thing about ghosts," he replied, his voice carrying that deadly softness. "They only truly die when people stop believing in them. When evil men forget why they used to look over their shoulders on dark nights." Through the windows of the watering hole, Margaret watched the scene unfold, noting how the morning light caught Tom's silver hair, how his familiar frame now carried a different kind of presence. He wasn't just standing in the street, he was controlling it, every subtle shift of his weight speaking to years of experience in precisely this kind of deadly dance. "Those Carson brothers," Wade continued, trying to master his pain, "they were friends of Blackjack's, close friends. When he hears you're here—" "He'll what?" Tom interrupted quietly. "Come faster, come slower, bring more men." His voice remained gentle, almost conversational, but carried an edge that made everyone listening fight the urge to step back. "The only choice Blackjack has now is how many of his men he wants to sacrifice, learning what the Carson brothers learned, that some lines you don't cross, some places you don't bring your kind of violence." Sheriff Carson had managed to get most of the townspeople off the street, but they watched from windows and doorways, seeing their quiet bartender in a completely new light. Doc Williams stood in his clinic doorway, medical bag ready but expression thoughtful, as if finally understanding why Tom had never needed treatment for the various cuts and bruises that came with saloon work. "You don't understand," Wade tried again, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning cool. "Blackjack's different now. Worse. The war changed him, made him—" "The war didn't make him anything," Tom cut in, his voice suddenly hard as granite. "War just gives men like him permission to be what they always were, gives them excuses for the darkness they always carried." His eyes swept the street, taking in Wade's remaining men with a gunfighter's practiced assessment. "Just like peace. Gives men like me a choice about what we become." One of Wade's men, younger than the others and clearly nervous, let his hand drift toward his gun. Tom's voice stopped him cold. "Son, if you pull that iron, I'll put you in the ground before it clears leather. Not because I want to, but because some lessons need to be final to be understood." The young rider's hand froze, then slowly moved away from his weapon. Something in Tom's voice, that deadly certainty carried in gentle tones, convinced everyone present that this wasn't a threat. It was simply a fact, as undeniable as sunrise. "Now," Tom continued, his voice returning to that quiet softness that somehow seemed more dangerous than any shout, "you boys have a choice to make. You can ride out of Hollow Creek, take word back to Blackjack that this town isn't what he thinks it is. Tell him what you found here, what's waiting for him. Or," Wade managed through clenched teeth, "or you can try your luck," Tom replied simply. "Test whether the stories about the ghost were exaggerated. Find out firsthand why they say I never needed more than one shot per man, why they say no one ever saw me draw, just heard the thunder and watched their friends fall." The morning wind stirred dust devils in the street as Wade's men exchanged glances, weighing their options. They'd come expecting to terrorize a helpless town, to play their part in Blackjack Morrison's carefully orchestrated campaign of fear. Instead, they'd found something from the old stories, a legend they'd dismissed as campfire tales made flesh. "One last thing," Tom added, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "When you tell Blackjack what you found here, Tell him. Something else, too. Tell him I know what he did in Arkansas. Tell him I know about the school. Wade's face went pale. How could you? Because that's why I came here, Tom interrupted quietly. That's why I chose this town, this quiet life, because I heard about what he did to those children, how he used them to make his point. Been waiting ever since, keeping my skills sharp, keeping watch, knowing that eventually men like him can't help themselves. They have to keep pushing, keep hurting, keep believing they're untouchable. The morning sun continued to climb as Wade and his men digested this information. They saw now that what they'd thought was a simple show of force had become something else entirely, a carefully laid trap, years in the making, just waiting for them to spring it. "You've got 1 hour," Tom said finally, his voice gentle but brooking no argument. "1 hour to gather your wounded, mount up, and ride out. After that—" He let the sentence hang unfinished, but its meaning was clear in the way his hand rested near his gun, in the absolute stillness of his stance. Wade struggled to his feet, cradling his injured hand. "This isn't over," he managed, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Tom agreed softly, "it isn't. But how it ends, that's still up to you and Blackjack. Sometimes the smartest thing a man can do is recognize when he's pushing against something he doesn't understand, something that's been waiting patiently for exactly this moment." The ghost of the West had indeed returned, and Hollow Creek was about to learn why some legends are best left to their rest, and why some are needed now more than ever. In the hour that followed Wade's departure, Hollow Creek seemed to hold its breath. Tom Sullivan stood watch from the watering hole's entrance, his stance relaxed, but his eyes missing nothing as the remaining riders gathered their wounded and prepared to leave. Each movement spoke of the deadly grace that had been hiding behind a bartender's careful efficiency for all these years. Margaret approached him cautiously, noting how he tracked multiple threats simultaneously without seeming to move at all. "That business about Arkansas," she said quietly, "about the school, that's why you really came here, isn't it? You weren't just hiding, you were waiting." "Been tracking Blackjack Morrison for longer than most folks realize," Tom replied, his voice carrying that gentle quality that now everyone understood masked something far more dangerous. "After what he did to those children, made it my personal mission. Followed his trail across 3 territories, watching him gather men, build his reputation, become something worse than just another outlaw." Sheriff Carson joined them, his badge catching the morning light. "Why didn't you take him then, when you first started tracking him?" Tom's eyes never stopped their careful scan of the street as he answered. "Man like that, he's got to be ended right. Not just killed, discredited, destroyed in a way that sends a message to others who might follow his path. Had to wait until he showed his true nature, until there were witnesses to what he really is." Through the windows, they watched as Wade's men helped their leader mount up, their previous bravado replaced by the careful movements of men who knew they were being watched by something deadly. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street, each one a potential hiding place for a ghost they'd previously dismissed as legend. "They'll be back," Doc Williams observed, joining their conversation. "Men like that, their pride won't let them just ride away." "Counting on it," Tom replied softly. "Counting on Blackjack's rage when he hears about this. Counting on him making the same mistake the Carson brothers made, thinking they could overwhelm a ghost with numbers, with firepower." His voice took on that deadly softness, never understanding that a ghost's real power isn't in his gun, but in his patience. As Wade's men finally rode out, a subtle change came over the town. People emerged from their hiding places, but their eyes now turned to Tom with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and something else, fear perhaps, or the uncomfortable realization that they'd had a legend living among them all this time. "They're afraid," Margaret noted, watching the townspeople's reactions, not just of what's coming, but of you, of what you can do. Should be, Tom acknowledged quietly. Man who can do what I just did, who can draw that fast, shoot that straight. He's dangerous. Question they're asking themselves now is whether I'm more dangerous to them or for them. Sheriff Carson studied his old friend's face. And the answer? Depends on them, Tom replied, his eyes still tracking the departing riders. On whether they understand that sometimes safety isn't about not having violence in your town. It's about having the right kind of violence on your side. The kind that stands between good folks and those who'd harm them. Inside the watering hole, Tom began making preparations with the same methodical care he'd shown in maintaining his bar. But now everyone saw his movements differently, understanding that each gesture served multiple purposes. Each position he took provided clear lines of sight to potential threats. They'll come at sundown, he said quietly, almost to himself. Blackjack always did prefer to ride in with the sun at his back, thinking it gives him an advantage, never understanding that real advantage isn't about position or numbers, it's about knowing exactly what you're willing to do and why. How many? Sheriff Carson asked, already calculating defense positions. He'll bring 30, maybe 40, Tom replied with that deadly certainty. Enough to overwhelm a normal town's defenses, enough to make sure everyone sees what happens when you resist. His voice hardened slightly, enough to make his point about those children in Arkansas permanent. Margaret watched as Tom checked angles and distances with practiced eye. What did he do in Arkansas? Tom's movement stilled completely, that predator's stillness that made everyone in the room hold their breath. Found a town like this one, peaceful, law-abiding, thought they could reason with him, negotiate. When they finally refused his demands, Tom's voice carried an edge of cold fury now. He locked their children in the schoolhouse, told their parents that resistance has consequences. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Finally, Sheriff Carson spoke. The children, most survived, Tom replied softly, found them in time. But the lesson, what it did to that town, watching their children used as bargaining chips, that's what he really wanted. That's what he's been doing ever since. Breaking not just bodies but spirits, making examples that leave scars deeper than bullet wounds. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the watering hole's windows as Tom resumed his preparations. But now everyone understood they weren't just watching a man get ready for a fight. They were watching justice being prepared, served cold and calculated by a ghost who'd spent years waiting for exactly this moment. When he comes, Tom said quietly, his voice carrying that gentle quality that now everyone recognized as a warning. He'll learn what those Carson brothers learned, that some things are worth waiting for, that some legends don't fade, they just get more dangerous with age. The ghost of the West had indeed returned, and Blackjack Morrison was about to learn why some men are feared not for their cruelty, but for their patience in delivering justice. The afternoon sun cast deepening shadows across Hollow Creek as Tom Sullivan continued his methodical preparations. Inside the watering hole, what had once seemed like simple habits of an orderly bartender now revealed themselves as the careful arrangements of a tactical mind. Each table was positioned to provide cover, each sightline carefully measured, each potential point of entry accounted for with deadly precision. "You've been planning this for years," Margaret observed, watching as Tom made subtle adjustments to the room's layout. "Everything about this place, it wasn't just a saloon, was it? It was a fortress in waiting." Tom's movements never faltered as he responded, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that had taken on new meaning. Man spends enough time thinking about killing, he starts seeing the world different, starts understanding how ordinary things become weapons, how peaceful places become battlegrounds. He paused, adjusting a mirror's angle slightly. Question was never if Blackjack would come, just when. Sheriff Carson entered, his face grave with fresh intelligence. Got word from the telegraph office. Reports of riders gathering in the hills south of town. Professional types by the description. Military trained. Mercenaries, Tom confirmed softly. Blackjack always did prefer men who'd learned killing properly before turning outlaw. Makes them more efficient, more controlled. His eyes never stopped their careful scan of the room. Makes them more dangerous to normal folks, less dangerous to someone who knows their training. Through the windows, they could see Doc Williams organizing volunteers, preparing his clinic for what everyone now knew was coming. The afternoon light caught the silver in Tom's hair as he watched their preparations, his expression unreadable, but his stance carrying decades of deadly experience. "Tell me about the Carson brothers," Margaret said quietly. "Wade seemed particularly afraid when you mentioned them." Tom's hands stilled on the bar top, his fingers tracing patterns only he could see. Carson brothers were like Blackjack, men who'd learned warfare proper, then turned those skills to darker purposes. Thought numbers and training made them untouchable. Thought they could hurt anyone they pleased without consequences. "What happened to them?" Sheriff Carson asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. "They made a mistake," Tom replied, his voice carrying that deadly softness. "Found a town like this one, peaceful, quiet, decided to make an example of it." He resumed his preparations, each movement measured and precise. "Didn't know I'd been tracking them for months. Didn't know every act of cruelty they committed was just adding weight to the justice that was coming." Margaret watched as Tom checked his weapon again, the motion so smooth it seemed almost unconscious. "How many were there?" 8 brothers, Tom answered quietly. "All trained soldiers, all turned bad after the war, all thinking they were above the law, above justice." His voice took on an edge that made everyone present remember exactly who they were talking to. "Took them in Crimson Valley, 1 shot each, just like the stories say. Clean, professional, the kind of work that sends a message." The afternoon deepened as more volunteers arrived, each carrying their own piece of the town's defense. Tom watched them through the windows, his eyes measuring their movements, assessing their potential usefulness in what was to come. "These people," Margaret said softly, "they're not soldiers. They're not killers." "No," Tom agreed, his voice gentle but firm. "They're better than that. They're folks worth protecting, folks willing to stand against evil, even when it wears a uniform and carries military credentials." His eyes met hers. "That's why Blackjack's kind can never truly win. They don't understand that real strength isn't in how many men you can kill. It's in what you're willing to die protecting." Sheriff Carson checked his own weapon, the gesture amateur compared to Tom's fluid grace. "What's your plan, when they come?" Same plan I've had for 10 years, Tom replied, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that had made hardened killers step carefully. "Let them come in thinking they understand the situation. Let them think numbers and training give them the advantage. Let them think their cruelty makes them strong." His voice hardened slightly. "Then teach them what the Carson brothers learned, that some lessons are best taught by a ghost." Outside, the sun continued its westward journey, painting Hollow Creek in shades of amber and shadow. The town had changed since morning, transformed from a peaceful community into something else. A place where justice had awakened, where legend had become reality. "You could have killed Wade," Margaret observed. "Could have ended this before it began." "Could have," Tom acknowledged softly. "But this isn't about Wade. It's about Blackjack. About making sure what happened in Arkansas never happens again. About sending a message that will echo through every territory where men think military training gives them the right to prey on the peaceful." The ghost of the West had indeed returned, and as the shadows lengthened over Hollow Creek, everyone present understood they were watching more than just preparation for violence. They were watching justice being crafted by hands that had never forgotten their deadly trade. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the watering hole's windows as Tom Sullivan made his final preparations. With each passing hour, the transformation of the quiet bartender became more complete. Though not in ways most would expect, there was no dramatic change in his demeanor, no sudden shift to a hardened killer's stance. Instead, it was as if layers of carefully maintained civility were gradually falling away, revealing the deadly efficiency that had always existed beneath. Blackjack's advance riders are back, Sheriff Carson reported, entering through the back door. They're watching the town from the ridgeline, taking measure of our preparations. Tom continued his methodical work, his movements carrying that predator's grace that now everyone recognized. "Good," he said softly. "Let them see what we want them to see. Let them think they understand what they're facing." Margaret watched as he positioned another mirror, understanding now that each reflection served multiple purposes, not just for ambiance, but for tracking movement, for eliminating blind spots. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "Man spends enough time hunting other men," Tom replied, his voice carrying that deadly gentleness. "He learns to think like them, learn their habits, their preferences, their weaknesses." His eyes never stopped their careful scan of the room. Blackjack likes to think he's unpredictable, thinks his cruelty makes him dangerous, never understood that real danger isn't in being unpredictable, it's in being patient. Through the windows, they could see Doc Williams and his volunteers setting up additional medical stations in surrounding buildings. The preparations spoke of the grim reality everyone now faced, that before the sun rose again, Hollow Creek would witness something few had ever seen and lived to tell about. "Tell me something," Margaret said, watching Tom check sightlines for the third time. All these years, serving drinks, listening to stories, being part of this community, was any of it real? Tom's movement stilled completely, that predator's. Pause that made everyone present hold their breath. "All of it was real," he said finally, his voice soft but carrying absolute conviction. "That's what Blackjack never understood about men like me. We don't pretend to be peaceful. We choose it. Choose it every day, knowing what we're capable of, knowing what lives inside us." Sheriff Carson cleared his throat. "And now?" "Now," Tom replied, his eyes distant. "Now, we remind some very dangerous men why that choice matters. Why a man who chooses peace, who understands its value, becomes something far more dangerous when that peace is threatened." The afternoon deepened as more reports arrived. Riders spotted on every approach to town, professional men taking up strategic positions. Blackjack was deploying his forces with military precision, setting up a net that would have trapped any normal community. "They're surrounding us," one of Carson's deputies reported nervously, "cutting off every escape route." "Not surrounding," Tom corrected quietly. "Containing, controlling lines of sight, angles of approach, setting up fields of fire." His voice carried that deadly certainty as he continued his preparations. "Doing exactly what I've spent 10 years preparing for." Margaret watched as he moved through the saloon, noting how each position he took seemed to cover multiple angles, how every casual gesture masked careful calculation. "This is why you never rearrange the furniture, isn't it? Why everything had to stay exactly in its place?" "Partly," Tom acknowledged. "Man lives with death long enough, he starts seeing the world different, starts understanding how ordinary things become extraordinary when violence visits." His hands moved over the bar's surface with familiar grace. Every bottle, every glass, every mirror, they're all tools, all weapons if you know how to use them. The sun continued its westward journey as Hollow Creek waited, caught in that strange quiet that comes before violence changes everything. Through the windows, they could see townspeople moving with nervous purpose, carrying out their parts in Tom's carefully orchestrated preparations. "You know what bothers them most?" Tom said suddenly, his voice carrying that gentle quality that now everyone understood masked something far more dangerous. Not the shooting, not the killing. What bothers them is the waiting, the knowing that something's coming but not knowing exactly when, exactly how. "And you?" Margaret asked softly. "Me?" Tom's smile was slight but carried no warmth. "I've been waiting for 10 years, every drink served, every glass polished, every quiet moment, all of it leading to this. To the moment when Blackjack Morrison learns why some legends aren't just stories, why some ghosts don't rest until justice is served." The sun touched the western horizon, painting Hollow Creek in shades of crimson and gold as Tom Sullivan completed his final preparations. The watering hole, once a simple saloon, had transformed into something else entirely. A carefully crafted trap, designed by a man who understood exactly how violence would unfold in its confines. "First riders coming in," Sheriff Carson reported, his voice tight with tension. 3 from the east, 2 from the north, moving like military men. Tom stood at the window, his stance relaxed, but his eyes missing nothing as he tracked the approaching horsemen. "Scouts," he said quietly, that deadly softness in his voice growing more pronounced, "testing our response, measuring our readiness, looking for weak points in our preparations." Through the gathering dusk, they watched as the riders moved through town with calculated precision, their formation speaking of professional training and coordinated purpose. These weren't common bandits. They were soldiers turned predator, men who had learned warfare before turning to outlawry. "They're checking the buildings," Margaret observed, noting how each rider seemed to have specific assignments, making notes, marking positions. "Yes," Tom agreed, his voice carrying that gentle quality that now everyone understood masked lethal capability. "Doing exactly what I've spent years preparing for, seeing exactly what I want them to see." His hands moved with unconscious grace as he adjusted his gun belt. Making the same mistake the Carson brothers made, thinking they understand what they're facing. Inside the watering hole, shadows deepened as the last light faded. Tom had positioned lanterns carefully, creating pools of illumination that would seem random to most observers, but that Margaret now recognized as deliberately crafted killing grounds. "Tell me something," she said, watching as another group of riders appeared at the town's western edge. "All these years, every time you cleaned a glass or served a drink, were you imagining this? Planning how it would play out?" Tom's movement stilled completely, that predator's pause that had taken on new meaning since morning. "Not imagining," he replied softly. "Remembering. Remembering what men like Blackjack do when they think they're untouchable. Remembering what has to be done when evil mistakes patience for weakness." The scouts continued their careful assessment of Hollow Creek, their very professionalism making them predictable to a man who had spent decades understanding how such men think. Each position they took, each angle they checked, seemed to fit into a pattern only Tom could fully see. "They're good," Sheriff Carson admitted grudgingly, watching their coordinated movements. "Professional, thorough. Too thorough," Tom corrected quietly. "Too confident in their training, their numbers, never understanding that real ghost stories aren't about spectral apparitions. They're about justice that comes without warning, without mercy, and without fail." As darkness settled more fully over the town, the scouts completed their initial survey and regrouped near the livery stable. Their manner suggested satisfaction with their assessment, confidence in their tactical advantage. "They think they have the upper hand," Margaret noted, watching their relaxed postures. "Of course they do," Tom replied, his voice carrying that deadly certainty. Men like that, they count on numbers, on training, on fear. They're looking at this town and seeing what any military man would see: limited defenders, poor positioning, civilian targets that make resistance risky. What should they be seeing? Sheriff Carson asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. A trap, Tom said simply, his hands moving with that fluid grace as he checked his weapon one final time. A carefully prepared killing ground designed by someone who spent 10 years learning every shadow, every angle, every possible way that violence could unfold in these streets. Through the gathering darkness, they watched as the scouts rode out, presumably to report back to Blackjack. Their departure carried an air of finality. The next riders to enter Hollow Creek would come with blood on their minds. "How long?" Margaret asked, watching the last riders disappear into the growing night. "An hour," Tom replied with that quiet certainty that had made hardened killers step carefully. "Blackjack will want to digest their reports, adjust his plan accordingly. Then he'll come, thinking he understands what he's facing, thinking his military training gives him the advantage." "And what is he really facing?" Sheriff Carson asked softly. Tom's smile was gentle, but carried no warmth. What the Carson brothers faced in Crimson Valley, what every man who mistakes cruelty for strength eventually faces, a reminder that some legends aren't just stories, some ghosts don't rest until justice is served. Night settled over Hollow Creek like a heavy blanket, broken only by carefully placed lanterns that cast islands of light amid the growing darkness. Inside the watering hole, Tom Sullivan stood watch, his posture relaxed but his eyes constantly moving, measuring, assessing. The transformation that had begun at dawn was now complete. The quiet bartender had fully awakened into something else entirely. "Riders coming," Sheriff Carson reported from his position near the back door. "At least 40, maybe more, moving in formation, military style." Tom's response carried that deadly softness that had made his legend. "Right on time," he said quietly. "Blackjack always did prefer to move his main force after full dark. Thinks it gives him tactical advantage, lets him control the engagement." Through the windows, they could see the first riders entering town, their approach speaking of professional training and coordinated purpose. They moved in precise formations, each man knowing his role, each position carefully chosen to support their overall strategy. "They're securing the streets," Margaret observed, watching as groups of armed men took up positions at key intersections, cutting off escape routes, controlling movement. "Yes," Tom acknowledged, his voice carrying that gentle quality that now everyone understood masked lethal capability, following standard military doctrine for taking a hostile town, establishing control, isolating defenders, creating zones of dominance. His hands moved with unconscious grace as he adjusted his position slightly, making the same mistake that every man who relies too much on training eventually makes, thinking that violence can be controlled, contained, predicted. The night deepened as more riders filtered into town, their movements suggesting absolute confidence in their tactical superiority. Blackjack Morrison's reputation for military precision was evident in every aspect of their deployment. "They're good," Sheriff Carson admitted, watching their coordinated advance. "Better than ordinary outlaws." "They're predictable," Tom corrected softly. "Men who learn killing from a manual, who think warfare can be reduced to rules and formations. They never understand that real combat, real violence, it's about something else entirely, something that can't be taught in any army." Through the carefully arranged mirrors, they could track multiple groups of armed men taking up positions throughout Hollow Creek. Each movement seemed calculated, each position chosen with tactical precision. "What are they waiting for?" Margaret asked, noting how the riders had stopped their advance just short of the watering hole. "For their message to sink in," Tom replied, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that had made his name legend, for the town to understand how completely they're surrounded, how helpless they appear to be. Blackjack always did enjoy the moment when hope starts to die in people's eyes. As if summoned by his words, a lone rider emerged from the darkness, his presence commanding attention, even from a distance. Blackjack Morrison sat his horse with military bearing, his very posture speaking of absolute authority and complete confidence in his power. "Last chance, Tom," Margaret said softly, watching as more armed men appeared out of the shadows. "You could still walk away, find another town, another life." Tom's smile was gentle but carried no warmth. "Walking away is what let him do what he did in Arkansas," he replied quietly. "Walking away is what lets men like him think they're above justice, above consequences. Sometimes," his voice took on that deadly softness, "sometimes a ghost has to stop walking away and start walking toward." Blackjack's voice carried clearly through the night air, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. "I know you're in there, Ghost," he called out. "Know you've been waiting for this, but you've grown old, grown soft. While you've been playing bartender, I've been building an army." Tom's response was so quiet that even those inside the watering hole had to strain to hear it. "Aging's funny that way," he said, seemingly to himself. "Makes some men weak, makes others dangerous, makes some forget what they're capable of, makes others remember exactly why they chose peace in the first place." Through the windows, they could see Blackjack's men taking final positions, each movement speaking of absolute confidence in their superior numbers and training. They had surrounded the watering hole completely, creating what they clearly believed was an inescapable trap. "They think they have us cornered," Sheriff Carson observed grimly. "No," Tom replied, that deadly certainty in his voice growing stronger. "They think they're hunting a ghost, about to learn what the Carson brothers learned, that real ghosts don't hide from violence. They wait for it, shape it, turn it back on those who think cruelty makes them strong." Blackjack Morrison's voice cut through the night air again, carrying the confidence of a man who believed absolute power was within his grasp. "You know what makes this perfect, Ghost? After all these years, after all the stories, I finally get to show everyone what you really are. Just an old man hiding behind a legend." Inside the watering hole, Tom Sullivan remained perfectly still. That predator's stillness that had taken on new meaning since dawn. Margaret watched as his eyes tracked multiple threats simultaneously, noting how even his stillness seemed to serve a tactical purpose. "Thing about legends," Tom replied, his voice carrying that deadly softness that made hardened killers pause, "is they're born from truth, born from moments when men have to decide what they stand for, what they're willing to do to protect what matters." Through the carefully positioned mirrors, they could see Blackjack's men completing their encirclement of the saloon. Their movements spoke of military training, of absolute confidence in their tactical superiority. Each man knew his role, each position had been carefully chosen to support their overall strategy. "Those children in Arkansas," Blackjack called, out his voice taking on an edge of cruel amusement. "They believed in legends too, believed someone would come, save them, believed justice would prevail." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Learned different, didn't they?" Tom's hand settled near his gun with casual grace, the motion so smooth it seemed almost unconscious. "Yes," he replied quietly, though his voice carried clearly through the night. "They did learn something that day. Learned that some men mistake cruelty for strength, mistake fear for respect." His voice took on that gentle quality that now everyone understood masked lethal capability. "Learned that sometimes justice takes time, takes patience, but it always comes." Blackjack's laugh carried no humor. 40 men, Ghost, 40 trained killers. Each one hand-picked, each one proven. What do you think your legend can do against those odds? Same thing it did to the Carson brothers, Tom replied softly. Same thing it's done to every man who thought numbers and training made him untouchable. About to remind you why they called me Ghost, because no one ever saw where the shots came from, just heard the thunder and watched their friends fall. Through the windows, they could see Blackjack's face harden at the mention of the Carson brothers. Those were different times, he snarled. You were different then. Younger, deadlier. Age is funny that way, Tom responded, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that had made his name legend. Makes some men weak, makes others dangerous, makes some forget what they're capable of, makes others remember exactly why they chose peace in the first place. Margaret watched as Tom made one final check of his position, each motion carrying decades of deadly experience. They're going to rush the saloon, she observed. Try to overwhelm us with numbers. No, Tom corrected gently. They're going to do exactly what I've spent 10 years preparing for, going to learn what every man who mistakes patience for weakness eventually learns, that some ghosts don't haunt places. They wait in them. Blackjack's voice carried command as he addressed his men. Take him alive if you can. Want him to watch what happens next. Want him to understand what waiting got him. A front-row seat to history repeating itself. Lille. The night air grew heavy with tension as Blackjack's men prepared to move. Each man checked his weapon with professional efficiency. Each position was adjusted for maximum tactical advantage. They had surrounded the watering hole completely, creating what they clearly believed was an inescapable trap. Last chance, Ghost, Blackjack called out. Surrender now. Maybe I make it quick. Fight back. He let the threat hang unfinished. Tom's response was so quiet that even those inside the watering hole had to strain to hear it. Been waiting 10 years for this moment, he said, seemingly to himself. 10 years preparing this place, these angles, these lines of sight. 10 years remembering what justice costs, what it's worth. His voice took on that deadly softness. About to remind some very dangerous men why mothers used to whisper my name to make their children behave. The ghost of the West had indeed returned, and as Hollow Creek held its breath in the darkness, everyone present understood they were about to witness something few had ever seen and lived to tell about. A legend fully awakened, a ghost becoming terrifyingly real, and justice being served with a patience that made it all the more devastating. In the gathering darkness, the storm was about to break, and Blackjack Morrison was about to learn why some legends are best left to their rest, and why some ghosts never stop hunting until justice is served. The first shot came without warning, a whisper of steel on leather followed by the crack of gunfire. One of Blackjack's men toppled from his horse, his weapon unfired, his expression still registering surprise. Before his body hit the ground, 2 more shots rang out in rapid succession, each finding its mark with deadly precision. Inside the watering hole, Tom Sullivan moved with fluid grace, each motion precise and purposeful. His gun seemed to materialize in his hand without passing through the space between, just as the stories had always claimed. 3 more shots, 3 more of Blackjack's men discovering why the ghost's legend had endured for so long. Impossible! Blackjack's voice carried rage and disbelief. No one's that fast. No one's that accurate. Tom's response carried that deadly softness that had made hardened killers step carefully. Not about speed, he said quietly, though his voice reached every ear. Not about accuracy, about patience, about understanding that real power isn't in how many men you can kill. It's in knowing exactly which ones need killing and why. Through the carefully positioned mirrors, Margaret watched as Tom moved through the saloon like smoke, appearing at one window only to materialize at another. Each position had been carefully chosen years ago, each angle calculated to provide maximum advantage while offering minimum exposure. He's hunting them, Sheriff Carson observed with professional appreciation. Using their own tactics against them, their military training is making them predictable. Yes, Tom acknowledged softly, his gun claiming 2 more targets with mechanical precision. Men who learn killing from a manual, who think warfare can be reduced to rules and formations. They never understand that real combat isn't about position or numbers. It's about will, about knowing exactly what you're willing to do and accepting the cost. Blackjack's men were professionals, trained soldiers turned outlaw. But their very training worked against them now, making their responses standardized, their movements anticipated. Each time they tried to establish a firing position, they found themselves exposed to angles they hadn't considered, to lines of sight that seemed to appear and disappear like ghost trails in the desert. 8 men down, Margaret counted, watching as Tom's careful preparation began to show its true worth. And they haven't managed a single shot in return. 9, Tom corrected quietly, his gun speaking once more. About to be 10. Watch the man by the water trough. He's going to try something foolish because his training tells him to seek cover at any cost. As if summoned by his words, another of Blackjack's men made exactly that move, and paid for it with exactly the precision Tom had predicted. Blackjack's voice carried command as he tried to reorganize his forces. "Spread out! He can't cover every angle! He's just one man!" "That's where you're wrong, Jack," Tom replied, his voice carrying that gentle quality that now everyone understood masked lethal capability. "Not just one man. I'm every parent who watched you threaten their children, every peaceful soul who saw you mistake kindness for weakness, every piece of justice you thought you could outrun." The night air grew thick with gun smoke as Tom continued his methodical work. Each shot was deliberate, each target chosen with careful purpose. He wasn't just killing men, he was dismantling Blackjack's carefully constructed hierarchy, eliminating key lieutenants, destroying the command structure that made the Outlaws' military precision possible. "He's taking apart their organization," Sheriff Carson realized, watching as another of Blackjack's senior men fell. Not just shooting targets, but systematically destroying their ability to function as a unit. "Yes," Tom agreed softly, his gun claiming another victim with that same deadly efficiency. "Man like Blackjack, he builds his power on structure, on discipline. Take that away, make his men remember they're just outlaws playing at being soldiers." He let the thought hang unfinished as 2 more shots demonstrated his point. Through the windows, they could see Blackjack's remaining men beginning to lose their military bearing. The precision of their movements was failing, replaced by the desperate scrambling of men who had suddenly realized they were not the hunters, but the hunted. 15 men down, Margaret counted, her voice carrying wonder. "And still, no return fire has even come close." 17, Tom corrected gently, his gun speaking twice more. "About to be 18. Watch the man behind the blacksmiths. He's going to try to reach that barrel. Going to learn what the Carson brothers learned, that some positions only look safe until a ghost shows you different." The ghost of the West had indeed returned, and as the night air filled with the sound of precise gunfire and falling men, everyone present understood they were witnessing something few had ever seen and lived to describe. A legend fully awake, a ghost becoming terrifyingly real, and justice being served with a patience that made it all the more devastating. Blackjack Morrison was about to learn why some legends persist, why some ghosts never rest, and why some men are feared not for their cruelty, but for their infinite patience in delivering justice. The night had transformed into a carefully orchestrated dance of death, with Tom Sullivan as its deadly choreographer. Through the smoke-filled darkness of Hollow Creek, his gun continued its methodical work, each shot placed with the precision of a surgeon, each target selected with tactical purpose. 20 men down, Blackjack's voice carried equal parts rage and disbelief. 20 trained killers, and not one of them even got close to you. What kind of devil's bargain did you make, Ghost? Tom's response carried that deadly softness that had become more pronounced as the night wore on. "No bargains, Jack. Just patience. Just the understanding that some debts can only be paid in blood, some justice can only be served with a gun." His weapon spoke twice more, adding emphasis to his words. "The kind of understanding that comes from watching men, like you mistake cruelty for strength, mistake fear for respect." Through the carefully positioned mirrors, Margaret watched as Tom continued his methodical dismantling of Blackjack's forces. Each shot seemed to serve multiple purposes, not just eliminating threats, but forcing the remaining men to move in predictable ways, herding them like cattle toward positions he'd prepared long ago. "They're breaking," Sheriff Carson observed, noting how the military precision of Blackjack's men had deteriorated into desperate individual survival attempts. "Their formations gone, their disciplines failing." "Yes," Tom acknowledged quietly, his gun claiming another victim with mechanical efficiency. "Strip away their structure, their chain of command, and what's left? Just men who learned killing from a manual, trying to fight something they don't understand." His voice took on that gentle quality that now everyone recognized as a warning. "About to learn what the Carson brothers learned, that some legends aren't just stories, some ghosts don't rest until justice is done." Blackjack's voice carried command as he tried to rally his remaining forces. "Stand your ground. He's just one man. He can't be everywhere." "That's where you're wrong again, Jack," Tom replied, his voice carrying clearly through the night. "Not trying to be everywhere, just exactly where I need to be, exactly when I need to be there." His gun punctuated his words with deadly precision. "Been rehearsing this dance for 10 years, learning every step, every turn, every moment when a man's training makes him predictable." The night air grew thicker with gun smoke as Tom continued his work. Each shot was deliberate, each target chosen with careful purpose. He wasn't just eliminating threats, he was sending a message written in gunfire and blood. A reminder that some legends persist because they carry truth too dangerous to forget. 25 down, Margaret counted, watching as another of Blackjack's men discovered why the ghost's reputation had endured so long. "And still not a single return shot has found its mark." 27, Tom corrected gently, his gun speaking twice more. "About to be 28. Watch the man by the church. His training's going to tell him to try for higher ground. Going to learn why some positions only look advantageous until a ghost shows you different." Through the windows, they could see the remaining men's faces transformed by growing terror. The confidence that had marked their arrival was gone, replaced by the desperate realization that they weren't facing a man at all, but something from the old stories, a force of nature wearing human form, justice given deadly purpose. "This is what you've been waiting for," Margaret said softly, understanding dawning in her voice. "Not just the chance to stop Blackjack, but the opportunity to remind everyone why some lines shouldn't be crossed." "Yes," Tom acknowledged, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that had made his name legend. "Man like Blackjack, he builds his power on making people believe that cruelty is strength, that violence is authority. Tonight's about reminding him, reminding everyone, that real strength isn't in how many men you can kill." His gun spoke again, emphasizing his point. "It's in knowing exactly which ones need killing, and being patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to teach that lesson." The ghost of the West had indeed returned, and as the night air filled with the sound of precise gunfire and falling men, everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would become legend itself. A ghost fully awakened, justice being served with terrible precision, and a reminder that some debts can only be paid in blood. Blackjack Morrison was about to learn why some legends endure, why some ghosts never rest, and why true justice, though patient, is no less devastating when it finally arrives. The night had become a symphony of precise violence, with Tom Sullivan conducting each deadly movement with surgical accuracy. 30 of Blackjack's men lay scattered across Hollow Creek's moonlit streets, each fallen exactly where Tom's careful planning had dictated they would, each discovering too late why the ghost's legend had endured for so long. "This isn't possible," Blackjack's voice carried across the gunsmoke-filled night, rage warring with growing fear. "No one man can do this. No one can plan this precise." Tom's response carried that deadly softness that had made hardened killers step carefully. 10 years, Jack. 10 years measuring every angle, calculating every distance, understanding exactly how men like you think. His gun spoke again, adding another proof to his argument. 10 years remembering what you did in Arkansas, remembering the faces of those children, remembering why some debts can only be paid in blood. Through the carefully positioned mirrors inside the watering hole, Margaret watched as Tom continued his methodical work. Each shot served multiple purposes, not just eliminating threats, but forcing the remaining men to move in ways he'd anticipated years ago, herding them toward positions that only looked safe until a ghost proved otherwise. "They're not even trying to fight back anymore," Sheriff Carson observed, noting how Blackjack's remaining men had abandoned any pretense of military discipline. "They're just trying to survive." "Yes," Tom acknowledged quietly, his gun claiming another victim with mechanical precision. "Strip away their training, their confidence, their belief in their own invulnerability, and what's left? Just men who thought cruelty made them strong, discovering too late why some legends carry warnings instead of glory." Blackjack's voice cracked with desperate authority as he tried to rally his diminishing forces. "Stand and fight, damn you! He's just one old man, just a story meant to frighten children." "That's where you're wrong again, Jack," Tom replied, his voice carrying that gentle quality that now everyone understood masked lethal capability. "Not just a story, not just one man. I'm what happens when justice gets tired of waiting, when patience turns to purpose." His gun punctuated his words with deadly emphasis. "I'm every parent who watched you threaten their children, every peaceful soul who saw you mistake kindness for weakness, every piece of vengeance you thought you could outrun." The night air grew heavier with gunsmoke as Tom continued his deadly work. Each shot was deliberate, each target chosen with careful purpose. He wasn't just eliminating threats, he was dismantling Blackjack's entire worldview. The belief that military training and superior numbers could overcome any obstacle, that cruelty could triumph over justice if the violence was sufficient. 35 down, Margaret counted, watching as another of Blackjack's men fell exactly where Tom had predicted. And still not a single return shot has found its mark. 37, Tom corrected softly, his gun speaking twice more. "About to be 38. Watch the man behind the livery. His training's going to tell him to try for cover behind those barrels, going to learn what every man who trusts too much in tactics eventually learns, that some positions only look safe until a ghost shows you different." Through the windows, they could see the remaining men's faces transformed by dawning comprehension. The arrogance that had marked their arrival was gone, replaced by the terrible understanding that they weren't facing a man at all, but something. From the old stories, justice given form and purpose, vengeance made patient and precise. "This is what you meant," Margaret said softly, understanding filling her voice. "When you said some fights are worth waiting for, it was never just about stopping Blackjack. It was about making sure everyone understands why some lines shouldn't be crossed." "Yes," Tom acknowledged, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that had made his name legend. "Man like Blackjack, he builds his power on making people believe that might makes right, that cruelty is strength. Tonight's about reminding him, reminding everyone, that real strength isn't in how many men you can kill." His gun spoke again, emphasizing his point. It's in knowing exactly which ones need killing and being patient enough to wait until the lesson will be perfectly clear. The ghost of the West had indeed returned, and as the night air filled with the sound of precise gunfire and falling men, everyone present understood they were witnessing something few would ever forget. A legend fully awakened, justice being served with terrible precision, and a reminder that some debts, though long delayed, are no less devastating when they finally come due. Blackjack Morrison was about to learn why some legends endure, why some ghosts never rest, and why true justice, though patient, is no less final when it arrives. The night had transformed Hollow Creek into a carefully orchestrated tableau of justice, with Tom Sullivan as its deadly artist. With 40 of Blackjack's men lying silent in the moonlit streets, the remaining few had lost all semblance of military bearing, their training forgotten in the face of something they couldn't understand, a legend made real, a ghost turned vengeful. "Just us now, Jack." Tom's voice carried that deadly softness through the smoke-filled night. "Just like it should have been from the start. You and me and all the weight of what you did in Arkansas." Blackjack Morrison stood alone in the street, his remaining men either fallen or fled. His military bearing remained, but something had changed in his stance, the absolute confidence replaced by the desperate calculation of a man who had finally understood too late what he was facing. "Those children," Blackjack's voice carried, a different edge now. They were just meant to be a message, just meant to show people what happens when they don't follow orders. "That's where you're wrong," Tom replied, his voice carrying that gentle quality that now everyone understood, masked lethal capability. They weren't just a message. They were a line you crossed, a debt you created, a reason for a ghost to stop, waiting and start hunting. Through the carefully positioned mirrors inside the watering hole, Margaret watched as Tom moved with fluid grace, each position chosen years ago for this exact moment. "He's not just going to kill him," she observed quietly. "He's going to make him understand why." "Yes," Sheriff Carson agreed, professional appreciation in his voice. "This isn't just about ending Blackjack. It's about making sure everyone remembers why some legends carry warnings instead of glory." Blackjack's laugh carried no humor, just the desperate bravado of a man trying to maintain his image until the end. "You think killing me changes anything? You think one ghost can stop what's coming? The frontier's changing, old man. Men like me, we're the future." "No, Jack." Tom's voice came from a different position now, though no one had seen him move. "Men like you're just the last gasp of something that's dying, something that never understood that real strength isn't in how many men you can kill." His gun appeared in his hand with that fluid grace that had made his legend. "It's in knowing exactly which ones need killing and being patient enough to wait until the lesson will be perfectly clear." The night air grew heavy with tension as the two men faced each other across the moonlit street. Blackjack's military training showed in his stance, in the way he held his weapon, in the calculation behind his eyes. But something else showed too, the growing realization that all his training, all his cruelty, all his carefully built reputation meant nothing in the face of a legend he'd dismissed as mere story. "You can't be this fast," Blackjack said, his voice carrying equal parts defiance and fear. "Can't be this accurate, not at your age, not after all these years." Tom's response carried that quiet certainty that had made his name legend. "Age is funny that way, makes some men weak, makes others dangerous, makes some forget what they're capable of, makes others remember exactly why they chose peace in the first place." His voice softened slightly, "About to remind you why they called me Ghost, because no one ever saw the shot that ended them, just heard the thunder and watched their world end." Through the windows, Margaret watched as Tom positioned himself with precise care, each movement calculated and purposeful. This wasn't just an ending, it was a message being crafted, a lesson being prepared with the same meticulous attention he'd shown while polishing glasses all these years. "Last chance, Jack," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the night. "Chance to understand why some legends persist, why some ghosts never rest until justice is served." The ghost of the West had indeed returned, and as Hollow Creek held its breath in the smoke-filled darkness, everyone present understood they were about to witness the final act of a story that had begun years ago in Arkansas. A legend fully awakened, justice being served with terrible precision, and a reminder that some debts, though long delayed, are no less devastating when they finally come due. The final confrontation unfolded like a scene from an old legend, with Tom Sullivan and Blackjack Morrison facing each other across Hollow Creek's moonlit street. The night air hung heavy with gun smoke and destiny as a decade of patient waiting reached its inevitable conclusion. "You think this ends with me?" Blackjack's voice carried forced bravado, but his eyes betrayed the fear beneath. "You think one ghost can change what's coming to these territories?" Tom's response carried that deadly softness that had made hardened killers step carefully. "This isn't about changing the territories, Jack. This is about reminding everyone why some lines shouldn't be crossed, why some debts don't fade with time." His voice took on that gentle quality that now everyone understood masked lethal capability, about showing them what happens when justice gets tired of waiting. Through the carefully positioned mirrors inside the watering hole, Margaret watched as Tom maintained his position with fluid grace. Every movement, every stance had been rehearsed over years of patient preparation, each angle calculated for this exact moment. "You want to know something funny, Ghost?" Blackjack's hand hovered near his gun, military training warring with growing desperation. "Those children in Arkansas, they begged for someone like you, begged for a hero to save them, begged for justice to come." "Not justice," Tom corrected quietly, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that had made his name legend. "What they begged for was mercy. What they're going to get is justice. The kind that comes patient and cold, the kind that waits years if necessary, but never forgets its purpose." Tom Sullivan stood in the moonlight, his gun still held with that deadly grace that had made his name legend. The quiet bartender and the deadly ghost had merged into something unique, a protector who understood that sometimes justice requires infinite patience, and sometimes it requires a single perfect shot. Dawn crept over Hollow Creek with uncertain steps, its early light revealing what the night's violence had wrought. 41 men lay scattered across the dusty streets, each positioned exactly where Tom Sullivan's patient planning had dictated. They would fall. Blackjack Morrison's body lay in the center of the street, a single precise shot marking the end of his reign of terror. Inside the watering hole, Tom moved with the same measured grace he'd shown for 10 years, his hands automatically, reaching for a glass to polish. The transformation seemed to reverse itself, the deadly ghost receding, the quiet bartender returning, though now everyone understood they were one and the same. "You're polishing glasses," Margaret observed, watching his familiar motions. "After everything that just happened, you're polishing glasses." Tom's response carried that gentle quality, but now it held something different, not warning, but wisdom. "Man spends enough time dealing death," he said softly. "He learns to appreciate the simple things, the quiet moments, the tasks that bring order to chaos." Sheriff Carson entered, his boots tracking dust across floors that had witnessed a legend's resurrection. "Federal marshals on his way," he reported. "Word of what happened here. It's spreading fast, already reaching other territories." "Good," Tom replied, his hands never stopping their methodical work. That's what tonight was really about. Not just ending blackjack, but sending a message, reminding everyone why some lines shouldn't be crossed. Through the windows, they could see townspeople emerging tentatively into the morning light. Their faces showed a mixture of awe and understanding as they surveyed the precise placement of fallen men, each position telling part of a story about patience, justice, and the price of threatening the peaceful. "They're going to want to know everything," Margaret said, watching as more people gathered in the street. "Want to understand how one man could do this, how the quiet bartender they knew for 10 years could be this." Tom's smile was gentle but carried new weight. "Let them wonder. Let them tell the stories. That's how legends work, not just through what people know, but through what they don't quite understand, through the questions that keep them thinking about consequences." Doc Williams entered, his medical bag lighter than expected given the night's events. "Not a single townsperson injured," he reported with professional amazement. 41 men down, and every shot so precise that none of them suffered unnecessarily. Even in death, you gave them more mercy than they showed those children in Arkansas. "Mercy and justice aren't always opposed," Tom replied softly, his hands still moving with practiced care over the glassware. "Sometimes the most merciful thing you can do is make sure the lesson is clear, make sure the message carries to others who might follow the same dark path." The morning light strengthened as more people filtered into the watering hole, each seeking to understand how their familiar gathering place had transformed into the site of a legend's return. But Tom continued his routine, each movement carrying both the deadly grace of the ghost and the careful precision of the bartender. "What happens now?" Sheriff Carson asked, watching as federal authorities began arriving to document what would surely become part of frontier legend. "Now," Tom replied, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that had made his name legend. "Now we go back to living. Back to showing everyone that peace isn't just the absence of violence, it's the presence of justice, even if that justice has to wait years to be served." Margaret watched as he continued his familiar routine, understanding now that every aspect of the watering hole, from the positioned mirrors to the arranged bottles, served multiple purposes. "Will you stay?" she asked softly, "now that everyone knows what you are, what you can do?" Tom's response carried the weight of years, of patient waiting, of careful preparation, of justice finally served. "A ghost doesn't just haunt places," he said quietly. The moonlight cast harsh shadows across the street as the two men measured each other. Blackjack's military bearing remained, but something had changed in his stance. The absolute confidence replaced by the desperate calculation of a man who had finally understood too late what he was facing. 40 men, Blackjack said, his voice carrying equal parts rage and disbelief. 40 trained killers, and you took them apart like they were children. How? How does one man do that? Tom's response came soft but clear through the night air. Not one man, Jack. Every parent who watched you threaten their children, every peaceful soul who saw you mistake kindness for weakness, every piece of justice you thought you could outrun. His hand rested near his gun with casual grace, about to remind you why they called me Ghost, because no one ever saw the shot that ended them, just heard the thunder and watched their world end. Inside the watering hole, Sheriff Carson watched with professional appreciation as Tom controlled every aspect of the confrontation. He's not just ending it, he observed quietly. He's making sure everyone remembers why it ended this way. Yes, Margaret agreed, understanding dawning in her voice. This isn't just about killing Blackjack. It's about making sure everyone understands why some legends carry warnings instead of glory. The tension reached its breaking point as Blackjack made his final decision. His hand moved toward his gun with military precision, every motion speaking to years of training and countless kills. But he was moving against something he didn't understand, A legend made real, a ghost turned vengeful, justice given form and purpose. What happened next became part of Hollow Creek's legend. Those who witnessed it would swear they never saw Tom's hand move, never saw the actual draw. There was just a whisper of steel on leather, a sound like distant thunder. And Blackjack Morrison discovered too late why some stories persist, why some ghosts never rest until justice is served. As Blackjack fell, his expression registered not pain but understanding, the final realization that all his training, all his cruelty, all his carefully built reputation meant nothing in the face of a legend he'd dismissed as mere story. The ghost of the West had indeed returned, and as the night air filled with the sound of one final precise shot, everyone present understood they had witnessed something few would ever forget. A legend fully awakened, justice being served with terrible precision, and a reminder that some debts, though long delayed, are no less devastating when they finally come due. He protects them, guards them, keeps watch over what matters. His eyes met hers. Been doing that here for 10 years. Don't see any reason to stop now. The ghost of the West had indeed returned, but in returning he had transformed into something more, a legend made flesh, a protector who understood that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in violence, but in the patient dedication to justice that makes violence unnecessary most of the time. As Hollow Creek began its journey back to normalcy, everyone understood that their quiet town had become something more, a reminder that some legends persist because they carry truth, that some ghosts never rest because justice demands their vigilance, and that sometimes the most dangerous man in a room is the one with the patience to wait years for the perfect moment to act. 1 week after the night that resurrected a legend, Hollow Creek had begun to settle into a new rhythm. The watering hole remained at its heart, though now everyone understood it was more than just a saloon. It was a symbol of patient justice, a reminder that some legends persist because truth demands they must. Tom Sullivan continued his daily routine with the same methodical care he'd shown for 10 years. His movements still carried that deadly grace, but now it was acknowledged openly, rather than quietly observed. Each glass he polished, each bottle he arranged, spoke to both the bartender's precision and the ghost's lethal efficiency. "Federal Marshal's report is official," Sheriff Carson announced, settling at his usual spot at the bar. 41 confirmed kills, each shot placed with surgical precision. No collateral damage, no innocent casualties. They're calling it the most precisely executed act of justice in territorial history. Tom's response carried that gentle quality that everyone now understood, masked years of patient purpose. "Justice isn't about numbers," he said softly, his hands never stopping their careful work. "It's about messages. About reminding people that some debts don't fade with time, that some lines shouldn't be crossed." Through the windows, they could see Hollow Creek transforming. New families had begun arriving, drawn not by the legend of violence, but by the promise of protection. Many were former soldiers and lawmen, each carrying their own burdens, each seeking what Tom had found, a place where strength could serve peace rather than threaten it. "They're coming because of you," Margaret observed, watching as another family unloaded their wagon outside. "Not because they fear the ghost, but because they understand what you represent." Tom's smile was gentle but carried new weight. "Coming because they understand that real strength isn't in how many men you can kill. It's in knowing exactly what you're willing to protect and having the patience to do it right." Doc Williams entered, his medical journal tucked under his arm as usual, but now he carried something else. Letters from other towns seeking advice, asking how to build their own sanctuaries for troubled souls seeking peace. "Your legend is spreading," he reported, "but not the old legend of the ghost. A new one, about a man who chose to protect rather than just punish." Best legends evolve, Tom replied softly, his eyes never stopping their careful scan of the room. Change from warnings into guides, show people that even the deadliest skills can serve life instead of ending it. The morning light strengthened as more patrons filtered into the watering hole, but now they moved differently, understanding that every aspect of the saloon, from the positioned mirrors to the arranged bottles, represented years of patient preparation, of careful dedication to both peace and justice. The stories reached Arkansas, Sheriff Carson said quietly. Those families, the ones whose children blackjack threatened, they're finding peace knowing justice finally came, even if it took years. Justice always comes, Tom responded, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that had made his name legend. Sometimes it has to wait, has to be patient. Sometimes it has to wear a bartender's apron and serve drinks for 10 years, but it always comes. Margaret watched as he continued his familiar routine, understanding now that the watering hole had become more than just a business. It was a symbol of transformation, of how the deadliest skills could be turned to protective purpose. "You're still watching," she noted, "still keeping guard." "Always will," Tom acknowledged softly. "Man spends enough time dealing death. He learns to appreciate what's worth protecting. Learns that sometimes the greatest service isn't in how many threats you eliminate, but in how many you prevent, just by being there, being watchful." The ghost of the West had indeed returned, but in returning, he had transformed into something greater, not just a legend of vengeance, but a symbol of protection. Hollow Creek had become more than just another frontier town. It was now a beacon for those seeking to transform their own deadly skills into something that served life rather than ended it. As the sun climbed higher over their transformed town, everyone understood that they had witnessed more than just the resurrection of a legend. They had seen the birth of something new, a reminder that some ghosts don't haunt places, they protect them, that some legends persist not because they're feared, but because they show us what's possible when strength serves justice, when patience guides power, and when even the deadliest skills can be turned to the preservation of peace. Tom Sullivan, the ghost of the West, had finally found his true purpose, not in ending evil, but in nurturing good, not in dealing death, but in protecting life. And in doing so, he had created a legacy that would outlive any legend, a place where troubled souls could find peace, where strength could serve justice, and where even the deadliest ghost could become the most dedicated guardian of tranquility. 1 month after the night that transformed Hollow Creek, the watering hole had become more than just a saloon. It stood as a living testament to the power of patient justice and protective strength. The morning sun streamed through windows that had witnessed a legend's resurrection, casting light on what the town had become in the wake of that fateful night. Tom Sullivan moved through his morning routine with the same measured grace that had characterized his decade of waiting. But now his movements carried acknowledged purpose. Each careful gesture, each positioned glass, a reminder that true strength lies not in the ability to take life, but in the dedication to protecting it. Another 3 families arrived yesterday, Margaret reported, watching as Tom arranged bottles with his characteristic precision. All former lawmen, all carrying the kind of shadows that come from seeing too much darkness, all drawn here by what happened that night. Tom's response carried that gentle quality that everyone now understood, masked years of protective purpose. "Not drawn by what happened," he corrected softly, his hands never pausing in their work. "Drawn by what it represented, by the proof that men can choose how to use their skills, that strength can serve something greater than violence." Through the carefully positioned mirrors, they could see Hollow Creek's transformation unfolding. What had once been a quiet frontier town had become something unique, A sanctuary where troubled souls could find purpose, where deadly skills could be turned to protective ends, where even the most haunted could find redemption in service to peace. Federal Marshal's office sent another letter, Sheriff Carson announced, settling into his usual spot. They're studying what happened here, trying to understand how one man's patient dedication to justice could transform an entire town. They're calling it the Hollow Creek Model, a new way of thinking about law and order in the territories. "They're missing the point," Tom replied, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that had made his name legend. "This isn't about one man or one night of justice served. It's about showing people that real strength isn't in how many men you can kill. It's in how many you can protect, how many you can help find their way back from darkness." Doc Williams entered, carrying a stack of newspapers from across the territories. Each one told the story differently, but all carried the same essential truth, that Hollow Creek had become more than just another frontier town. It had become a symbol of transformation, of how even the deadliest skills could be turned to life-preserving purpose. "The stories are spreading," the doctor reported, laying out the papers, "but not just about the ghost or the night of reckoning. They're telling a different kind of story now, about a place where troubled men can find peace, where strength serves protection instead of destruction." Tom's smile was gentle, but carried new weight. "Best kind of legend," he said softly, "isn't about what was done, but about what's possible. About showing people that even the darkest paths can lead to light, if you're patient enough to find your way." Through the windows, they could see the town's new residents going about their morning routines. Former gunfighters who now served as mentors, teaching young deputies how to prevent violence rather than just respond to it. Ex-soldiers who had found purpose in protecting rather than destroying, each carrying their own version of the transformation Tom Sullivan had demonstrated. "You've created something unique here," Margaret observed, watching as another group of newcomers arrived, drawn by the growing legend of Hollow Creek. "Not just a sanctuary, but a model for what's possible when strength serves justice." "Created it together," Tom corrected gently, his eyes never stopping their careful scan of the street. "Town like this, it doesn't work because of one man's skills or one night's justice. Works because people understand that real peace isn't just the absence of violence, it's the presence of protection, the dedication to something worth preserving." The ghost of the West had indeed transformed, becoming something greater than just a legend of vengeance. He had become a symbol of possibility, proof that even the deadliest skills could serve life rather than end it, that patience could guide power, that protection could become purpose. As morning light filled the watering hole, casting long shadows across floors that had witnessed both violence and redemption, everyone understood that they were part of something unprecedented. A place where ghosts became guardians, where strength served peace, and where even the most troubled souls could find their way back to the light. The legacy of that one night of perfect justice would live on not in the number of men who fell, but in the number of lives transformed, in the proof that some legends persist not because they're feared, but because they show us what's possible when deadly skill serves protective purpose, when patience guides power, and when even the darkest past can lead to the brightest future. Tom Sullivan, the ghost of the West, had finally found his true calling, not in ending evil, but in nurturing good. And in doing so, he had created something that would outlast any legend, a place where peace wasn't just the absence of violence, but the presence of purpose. A reminder that some ghosts don't haunt places, they protect them, and in that protection find their own redemption. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.